On the morning of May 9th, 1980, drivers heading south across Tampa Bay had no warning that the road ahead simply ended. There were no barricades, no flashing signs, no alarms, just a stretch of highway rising into violent rain and fog, and then nothing. Within minutes, cars and a Greyhound bus would drive straight into open air, plunging more than 150 feet into the dark water below. 35 people would lose their lives, not because the bridge collapsed beneath them, but because the storm erased the final seconds when stopping might still have been possible. The Sunshine Skyway Bridge was one of Florida's most important transportation links. Spanning Tampa Bay, it connected St. Petersburg to Bradenton and carried U.S. Route 19 over one of the busiest shipping channels on the Gulf Coast. By 1980, the bridge system consisted of two parallel spans. The original two-lane bridge, built in the 1950s, carried southbound traffic. A newer, wider span, built later, handled northbound vehicles. Both rose high above the water to allow massive cargo ships to pass beneath them on their way to and from the port of Tampa. The bridge was an engineering achievement for its time, but it reflected the assumptions of the era in which it was built. While designed to withstand storms and normal marine traffic, its central support piers were largely unprotected. Massive concrete pillars stood directly adjacent to the shipping channel, with little more than water separating them from vessels weighing tens of thousands of tons. At the time, it was believed that modern navigation and standard maritime procedures were sufficient to prevent a direct collision. That belief would be tested on a morning when everything went wrong at once. Weather conditions over Tampa Bay deteriorated rapidly on May 9th. A powerful thunderstorm system moved through the area with exceptional speed and intensity. Torrential rain reduced visibility to near zero. Winds exceeded 70 miles per hour, strong enough to push large vessels off course. Lightning illuminated the sky in sharp flashes, followed by deafening thunder. The surface of the bay churned violently as waves collided and spray filled the air. For motorists on the Sunshine Skyway, the storm was disorienting, but not immediately alarming. Rain and wind are common in Florida, and drivers continued crossing the bridge, slowing but pressing forward. Visibility dropped to just a few car lengths. The bridge's height placed vehicles directly in the heart of the storm, where wind gusts were stronger and rain fell harder than at ground level. At the same time, a bulk carrier named Summit Venture was entering Tampa Bay. The ship was 608 feet long and heavily loaded with phosphate rock, making it slow to maneuver and difficult to stop. It was under the command of Captain Robert Clark, an experienced mariner navigating treacherous conditions while awaiting a harbor pilot to guide the vessel safely to port. As the storm intensified, the Summit Venture encountered serious navigational challenges. Rain overwhelmed visual references. Radar images became cluttered and unreliable due to interference from the storm. Strong crosswinds began pushing the ship sideways, a dangerous situation for a vessel attempting to maintain position within a narrow shipping channel. Captain Clark attempted to compensate by adjusting engine power and rudder angle, but the storm's force was overwhelming. The ship began drifting off its intended path, without clear visual confirmation of surrounding landmarks, and with radar returns distorted. The crew struggled to accurately assess their position relative to the bridge. As the Summit Venture drifted, it moved dangerously close to the Sunshine Skyway's southbound span. The massive concrete support pier loomed unseen ahead, obscured by rain and fog. The ship's size and momentum meant that even if the danger was recognized at the last moment, stopping or turning away would take far more distance and time than the storm allowed. By the time the crew realized the ship was out of alignment, it was already too late. At approximately 7:38 a.m., the bow of the Summit Venture slammed into the main support pier of the southbound Sunshine Skyway Bridge. The impact was catastrophic. The force transferred directly into the concrete structure, shattering critical support elements. Within seconds, a 1,260-foot section of the bridge collapsed. Roadway segments snapped loose and plunged into Tampa Bay, carrying vehicles with them. Concrete slabs, steel beams, and guardrails fell into the water below. The once continuous ribbon of highway was instantly transformed into a deadly gap suspended over open water. Rain and fog swallowed the scene, hiding the destruction from approaching drivers. Traffic continued moving toward the bridge, unaware that the roadway ahead no longer existed. In the seconds after the bridge collapsed, the storm continued to rage, masking the destruction it had just caused. Rain poured so heavily that visibility remained only a few car lengths. Wind howled across the remaining portions of the bridge. For drivers approaching the southbound span, there was still no sign that anything was wrong. The roadway appeared intact until it suddenly was not. The first vehicles to reach the gap had no time to react. Cars traveling at a highway speed emerged from the rain and drove straight into empty space. Some briefly became airborne before dropping more than 150 feet into Tampa Bay. The fall was violent and unforgiving. Vehicles struck the water with tremendous force, crumpling instantly. In many cases, occupants were killed on impact. Those who survived the initial crash faced freezing water, disorientation, and darkness amid debris. Moments later, a Greyhound bus carrying passengers across the bay entered the collapsed section. The driver never saw the missing roadway. The bus continued forward and plunged into the bay, breaking apart as it hit the water. Of all the vehicles that went over the edge, the bus carried the largest number of victims. Nearly everyone aboard was killed. In total, multiple cars, a pickup truck, and the Greyhound bus fell into the bay within minutes. The storm ensured that each vehicle arrived without warning. There were no skid marks, no evasive maneuvers, no final attempts to stop. Drivers simply disappeared into the rain. A few people survived, though survival often came down to chance. One man driving a pickup truck managed to escape his sinking vehicle and cling to floating debris. Another survivor, a woman whose car went over the edge, was thrown clear and surfaced amid wreckage. Both were injured, soaked, and fighting exhaustion as they waited for help in rough water. Above them, traffic on the bridge came to a confused halt. Some drivers stopped just short of the collapse, their headlights illuminating twisted concrete and open air. Others exited their vehicles in shock, shouting warnings to approaching cars. Several motorists narrowly avoided driving over the edge simply because they happened to slow down at the last moment. Emergency responders were immediately challenged by the same conditions that caused the disaster. Police, fire departments, and Coast Guard units were dispatched. But reaching the scene was difficult. High winds and pounding rain made navigation dangerous. The darkness beneath the bridge, combined with debris and fuel slicks, complicated rescue efforts. The Coast Guard launched boats into Tampa Bay, searching for survivors among the wreckage. Divers were deployed despite treacherous conditions. Visibility underwater was extremely poor. Strong currents pushed debris and victims away from the collapse site, expanding the search area. Rescue crews worked methodically, knowing that time was critical for anyone still alive in the water. By mid-morning, it became clear that the number of survivors was extremely small. Recovery replaced rescue as the primary mission. Vehicles were located on the bay floor. The Greyhound bus was found in pieces. Bodies were recovered slowly and respectfully as conditions allowed. The storm eventually passed, revealing the full scale of the destruction. A massive section of the Sunshine Skyway Bridge was simply gone. Concrete stubs jutted into the air where roadway once stretched across the bay. The shipping channel below was littered with debris. The scene was surreal, as if a piece of Florida's infrastructure had been erased. In total, 35 people lost their lives. Families across Florida and beyond were suddenly grieving loved ones who had left home that morning, expecting a routine drive. The bridge was immediately closed, severing a critical transportation link and sending shockwaves through the region. As recovery operations continued, one question dominated public attention. How could a modern bridge collapse without warning, and how could so many people drive to their deaths without a single chance to stop? In the days following the disaster, attention shifted from recovery to accountability. State and federal agencies launched immediate investigations to determine how a single ship collision could destroy a modern bridge and kill 35 people without warning. What they uncovered revealed a chain of failures, not one simple mistake, and exposed dangerous assumptions that had existed for decades. The National Transportation Safety Board, along with the Coast Guard and state authorities, examined the actions of the Summit Venture and its crew. Investigators confirmed that the ship had been caught in an exceptionally violent storm, but they also concluded that the vessel had lost proper positional awareness. Radar use was misinterpreted, visual references were non-existent, and critical navigational decisions were made under extreme pressure. While the storm was a major factor, it was not considered an unavoidable act of nature. Captain Robert Clark was found to have misjudged the ship's position relative to the shipping channel and the bridge. The investigation concluded that the Summit Venture had drifted far enough off course to strike the bridge's pier without corrective action being taken in time. Clark later admitted that he believed the ship was still safely within the channel when it was not. His captain's license was eventually suspended, and he faced both civil penalties and lasting professional consequences. However, investigators were clear that the ship's error alone did not explain the scale of the tragedy. The Sunshine Skyway Bridge's design became a central focus. Engineers determined that the bridge's support piers were dangerously exposed. There were no protective barriers, known as dolphins, surrounding the piers to absorb or deflect an impact from a large vessel. A direct strike transferred the full force of the ship into the structure, causing an immediate and total failure of the span. Even more troubling was the absence of any warning system. When the bridge collapsed, there were no automated barriers, no traffic lights, and no alarms to alert approaching drivers. In modern terms, the bridge had no failsafe. Once the structure was gone, motorists had nothing standing between them and open water. Lawsuits followed quickly. Families of the victims sued the shipping company, the captain, and state authorities. Settlements were reached, though no amount of money could undo the loss. Public trust in infrastructure safety was shaken, and Florida officials faced intense scrutiny over how such a vulnerable design had been allowed to remain in service. The state made a decisive choice. The damaged Sunshine Skyway Bridge would not be repaired. Instead, it would be dismantled, and a completely new bridge would be built from the ground up with safety as its primary focus. Construction began on a replacement unlike anything Florida had built before. The new Sunshine Skyway Bridge would feature massive concrete dolphins surrounding its central piers, designed specifically to withstand direct ship impacts. These protective structures were engineered to absorb collision forces and prevent ships from ever reaching the bridge supports themselves. Navigation lighting, weather monitoring, and maritime protocols were all improved as part of the redesign. When the new bridge opened in 1987, it stood not just as a transportation link, but as a monument to hard lessons learned. The original bridge's remaining spans were demolished, with pieces intentionally sunk nearby to form artificial reefs, turning tragedy into a source of marine life. The disaster permanently changed bridge engineering standards across the United States. New and existing bridges near shipping channels were reevaluated. Protective barriers became standard. Weather restrictions for large vessels were tightened. Communication between maritime traffic and port authorities improved nationwide. Today, drivers crossing Tampa Bay on the modern Sunshine Skyway see a graceful cable stayed structure rising safely above the water. Few realize that beneath it lies the legacy of one of Florida's deadliest infrastructure failures. The lives lost on May 9, 1980, forced changes that have since saved countless others. If you like this story, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment.